Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into, well, one of the most provocative and data-rich works of political science of the 21st century. We're talking about Erica Chenoweth's and Marie J. Stephan's book, Why Civil Resistance Works: The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict. And the central idea they tackled is profoundly disruptive to how we usually think about history and power.
It really is.
I mean, we're raised on these stories where power is all about the size of an army or how advanced your weapons are.
Right. Force equals strength.
Exactly. So the core question is, why is it that so many movements seeking fundamental political change movements that rely purely on things like boycotts, strikes, and protests have consistently achieved their goals, even when they're up against modern states with, overwhelming military power?
The intuition is that you have to meet force with force.
You have to. But Chenoweth and Stephan found that empirically the opposite seems to be true. This book uses rigorous systematic data from over 100 years of global conflict to challenge that entire assumption. And it reveals this surprising evidence-based truth about how power dynamics actually shift. It shows that since 1900, the nature of successful resistance has, it's decisively shifted away from violence. So our mission today is purely a systems analysis. We are not here to discuss the morality of nonviolence.
No, this isn't about philosophy.
Not at all. We are analyzing nonviolence as a measurable, and it turns out, a highly effective political technology. We want to understand the strategic logic. Why does one set of methods, this organized, nonviolent civilian resistance, produce successful outcomes so much more frequently than armed insurgency?
Especially when they're challenging these powerful, entrenched regimes.
Right. We're looking at the leverage points, the structural results, and just the cold, hard data that seems to determine success or failure in modern conflict.
And that focus on cold, hard data is precisely what makes this work so foundational. I mean, before Chenoweth, who's a political scientist, and Stephan, an international security expert, did this research, the whole field was very siloed.
Siloed how?
You had scholars who focused on terrorism and guerrilla warfare, and they almost never engaged with academics who were focused on peace studies or pacifism.
So two different worlds.
Completely different worlds.
Yeah.
They wanted to bridge that gap. They wanted to set up a direct empirical comparison to settle the question of relative effectiveness. It was really a mission to replace all our intuition with actual evidence.
Okay, so to do that, you'd need a massive amount of data. You can't just pick a few famous examples.
Exactly. You can't cherry pick.
Right.
So they built it. They generated nonviolent and violent campaigns and outcomes data set,
Right.
or NVICO for short.
NEBCO.
And this is a massive analytical tool. It covers every major resistance campaign that was aimed at regime change or territorial independence between 1900 and 2006.
Every major campaign.
There's 323 campaigns in total.
323. Wow. That is a huge pool of data. What exactly did they do with it?
They ran a rigorous quantitative analysis.
Right.
They didn't just, count who won and who lost. They tested dozens of variables against the campaign's success rate.
What kind of variables?
Things like the type of regime they were up against. Was it a democracy, an open authoritarian regime, a completely closed one? Also, the level of state repression they faced.
So how brutal the state was in response.
Precisely. And did they get external support, financially or militarily? And crucially, what was the level of participation the movement managed to get?
And I understand they also did more than just crunch the numbers.
They did. To supplement the stats, they also did these incredibly detailed qualitative case studies, real deep dives into the context and tactics of resistance in places like Iran, the Palestinian territories, Burma, and the Philippines.
Why? What was the goal there?
To understand the mechanisms of success and failure. The numbers can tell you what happened, but the case studies help explain how and why it happened.
Okay, but whenever you're crunching data on historical events, there's always this risk, right? Methodological challenges. You said these were major campaigns. How did they make sure they weren't falling into what political scientists call selection bias?
That's an excellent point to raise, and it is the single greatest challenge in this kind of research.
Right, the idea that you only study the things that are big enough to be noticed.
Exactly. Imagine you're studying how many people successfully climb Mount Everest, but your data only includes the climbers who got high enough for base camp to log their ascent.
You'd miss everyone who failed near the bottom.
You'd miss all the smaller, failed attempts that were never even documented. That's selection bias. Movements that fail quickly or just never get very big are often just erased from the historical record.
So your data would be skewed.
It could be. If you assume, for instance, that nonviolent movements are maybe more fragile and fail silently, your data might look artificially skewed against them. So Chenoweth and Stephan had to counter that strategically.
How did they do this?
First, they focused only on campaigns that reached a certain minimum size and duration. They made sure only major struggles were included, ones that had already left a historical footprint.
So they were only looking at campaigns that had already proven they had some significant organizational capacity, no matter the method.
Exactly. Second, their campaign selection was based on consensus data. They drew from multiple, often opposing sources to reduce the reliance on any single biased narrative.
Smart.
And third, and this is maybe the most critical part for the statistical rigor, they showed that nonviolent and violent insurgencies often pop up in very similar socio-political circumstances. Meaning the initial choice of method violent versus nonviolent isn't just a reaction to a situation where one is doomed to fail. It's a genuinely strategic choice made by the movement leaders. By controlling for all these variables, they made their core findings extremely robust.
And all of this was a response to this deep historical context, right? The one that for centuries has glorified armed struggle, the American Revolution, Che Guevara, all of that.
Absolutely. The default assumption was that you needed guns to win.
So after all that meticulous data collection, what was the single verifiable game-changing claim that emerged when they compared those 323 struggles?
The central claim is, well, it's a wholesale reversal of that conventional wisdom.
Oh.
And it's startling.
Go on.
Nonviolent resistance campaigns are nearly twice as likely to achieve full or partial success compared to their violent counterparts over the period from 1900 to 2006.
That's not a marginal difference. That's not something you can just explain away with a single variable. That's a decisive strategic gap.
Let's just cement the numbers for a second. Of all the nonviolent campaigns they studied, 53% achieved full or partial success.
53%. More than half.
More than half. Now, for violent insurgencies aiming for the exact same goals, regime change or territorial independence, that success rate plummets to only 26%.
26. Wow.
And that finding holds true even when they adjust the data for things like external intervention, how strong the regime is, or the country's economic profile.
Okay, let's unpack this. This success gap is undeniable. We're moving into the core ideas now, the strategic mechanisms behind this disparity. So that 53% versus 26% margin is our insight one. Did they notice any trends in how these numbers have changed over time?
They did, and it really highlights why this analysis is so relevant today. While violent campaigns, they certainly still happen, their success rates have actually been trending downward over the century.
Really? Downward?
Yes, and at the same time, the frequency of nonviolent campaigns has dramatically increased, especially since the end of the Cold War around 1990.
So we're seeing more of them, and they're working.
Exactly. Nonviolent campaigns achieve success against these incredibly entrenched authoritarian regimes in places like Serbia, Georgia, Ukraine, often by challenging rigged elections.
The so-called color revolutions.
Right. And they succeeded in ending foreign occupation, like in Lebanon in 2005. The whole strategic landscape is evolving. The old model of the successful armed insurgency, the classic guerrilla war, it's just delivering fewer and fewer results. Meanwhile, nonviolence is proving to be the more potent and more frequent strategic choice.
Which brings us to insight two, and you argue this is the primary driver of all of this success, participation size. Why is nonviolence inherently better at getting mass participation, and how does that scale become the actual leverage point?
Scale is the central systemic engine. It's everything. The data shows that nonviolent campaigns mobilize significantly more people. On average, get this, nonviolent campaigns involved 11 times the number of participants as violent campaigns.
11 times.
That 11x multiplier is the strategic core of the success gap.
Let's break that down. Why is it so hard for a violent campaign to scale up?
Well, just think about what it takes to join an armed insurgency, the logistical and physical requirements. It demands specialized physical skills, intensive training, often years of dedicated commitment. You need to be able to get and use weapons.
And you have to stay hidden.
Crucially, social isolation. You have to maintain secrecy to avoid state intelligence, the police. This inherently limits who can participate. It's a small, often young, fit, and demographically narrow slice of the population. An average successful violent campaign might have, several thousand dedicated fighters.
But nonviolent resistance, it requires none of that specialized training.
Exactly. Nonviolent action radically lowers the barriers to entry. The tactics are incredibly diverse, and that allows participation from every demographic, age, gender, social class, education level, physical ability.
Everyone can play a part.
What kind of tactics are we talking about?
The menu is huge. It ranges from high visibility, high-risk actions like mass protests, sit-ins, civil disobedience, all the way down to low-risk, everyday acts of organized non-cooperation.
Like what?
We're talking about massive economic boycotts, widespread general strikes that shut down key industries, slowdowns in the bureaucracy, refusing to obey traffic laws as a group, or even setting up underground schools to bypass the state education system.
So things people can do in their daily lives.
Yes, and when you include actions like candlelight vigils or prayer meetings, the risk profile drops even lower, and the potential recruitment base expands from thousands to literally millions.
And the numbers in the book bear that out perfectly. They looked at the 25 largest campaigns in their data set.
Right, over that whole 106-year period.
And 20 of those campaigns were nonviolent, only 5 were violent. And the success rate for the big nonviolent movements was 70% compared to just 40% for the largest violent ones. So scale just dramatically improves the odds.
And that scale is the mechanism that unlocks the most talked about finding from this research. Insight 3, the critical mass threshold, which we often just call the 3.5% rule.
That number, 3.5% of the population, that's the one that always makes people do a double take. Can you just explain the significance of that threshold?
It is truly stunning. When a campaign manages to mobilize the active, sustained participation of 3.5% of the population, Chenoweth and Stephan found that no such campaign has ever failed to achieve its objectives.
Wait, never.
Never.
Hold on, 3.5%. In a country of, say, 100 million people, that's 3.5 million participants. That sounds enormous in raw numbers, but as a percentage, it feels deceptively small. Why is that specific threshold a structural tipping point?
It sounds small, but it represents what systems theorists would call critical mass. This level of sustained participation, 3.5%, is the point where the regime's institutional capacity just fails.
Yeah.
It breaks.
How so?
It means the mobilization is so vast and so diverse that it's no longer just a fringe movement. It's a society-wide challenge that starts to paralyze the state's pillars of support.
The pillars we'll get to later.
Right. But just think about the practical logistics. If you have 3.5% of a major city actively boycotting, striking, or demonstrating, the police cannot arrest them all. The courts can't process them all. The prisons can't hold them all. Governance becomes physically impossible.
And at that scale,
those 3.5% are the neighbors, the family members, the colleagues of the security forces, the bureaucrats, the economic elites. That sheer ubiquity means the pressure for loyalty shifts becomes inescapable. The regime is overwhelmed not by force, but by sheer numerical saturation.
and as we just established, getting to that 3.5% is far more feasible for a nonviolent campaign because of its inclusive nature and lower physical risk.
Absolutely. A violent group might be thrilled to recruit 0.0035% of the population. A nonviolent group is aiming for 3.5%. That difference in aspiration and execution, well, that determines success.
Okay, so moving past just achieving victory, Insight 4 looks at what happens after the conflict. This is where the methodology really shows its systemic effect, right?
This is a critical structural finding that goes beyond just winning. The method you use to struggle actually prefigures the type of government that comes next.
What do you mean?
Successful nonviolent campaigns lead to more durable, democratic outcomes 61% of the time.
61%. Why such a strong correlation?
Because the process of organizing a massive nonviolent resistance, it inherently demands characteristics that translate directly into democratic stability. You need broad coordination, decentralized leadership, continuous negotiation, building coalitions between totally different groups, labor, students, religious organizations, business owners.
All things you need for a functioning democracy.
Exactly. All of these require deliberation and compromise, which are the absolute foundations of successful democratic governance. The movement, in effect, learns how to govern democratically before it even takes power.
And the contrast with violent campaigns.
It's stark. Successful violent campaigns are overwhelmingly more likely to result in new authoritarian regimes, military juntas, entrenched civil war, or just swapping one dictator for another.
And why is that?
Because a successful armed struggle requires centralized, hierarchical command, secrecy, often rigid ideological alignment. The reliance on violence and factionalism fosters a structure that just persists after the transition, and it undermines any move towards broad, inclusive governance.
So the argument is that the means you use to get power become embedded in the systemic DNA of the new state.
Precisely. If you centralize power to wage a war, you will centralize power to govern a peace. If you decentralize power to organize a general strike, you have already built a blueprint for dispersed democratic governance.
Let's talk about Insight 5, external support disparity. How does the rest of the world perceive and respond to these two types of conflict?
The international community basically acts as an amplifier for the strategic advantage of nonviolence. The data shows that nonviolent campaigns are significantly more likely, around a 40% likelihood, to get diplomatic support.
Meaning things like sanctions.
Often sanctions or boycotts against the incumbent regime, yes. And sanctions can be really potent leverage points. They can cripple a regime's economy without the direct risk of military intervention. They signal that the international community sees the resistance as legitimate.
And for violent groups, it's a different story.
The opposite is true. Violent campaigns are over 50% more likely to receive material support. So we're talking about arms and financial aid.
But that's a good thing for them, isn't it?
Not necessarily. It typically comes from foreign state sponsors who see them as geopolitical proxies. It means violent movements often get used as tools in larger international conflicts, rather than being seen as legitimate homegrown calls for democracy. International audiences, especially democratic states, find it so much easier to lend political support to nonviolent resistance because it doesn't involve getting tangled up in a civil war or the ethical mess of arming an insurgency.
Okay, finally we hit Insight 6, the backfire effect. This seems like the strategic linchpin. It's how the state's own greatest strength, its coercive power, gets turned against it.
The backfire effect is absolutely central to the strategic logic. When a disciplined nonviolent movement is repressed, when the state uses tanks or truncheons or bullets against unarmed, peaceful civilians, that act of repression doesn't silence the opposition. It strengthens it.
How?
It creates widespread moral outrage domestically. It draws in people who were previously neutral or hesitant, people who weren't willing to protest but are now just appalled by the brutality. And, most importantly, it fuels defections from the regime's own security forces.
So the regime loses the narrative battle.
It loses the narrative battle on the global stage and, critically, on the domestic stage. The state cannot easily justify mass violence against its own unarmed people, to its internal elites, to its business partners, or to the international press.
So the state basically walks into a structural trap. If they tolerate the protests, the movement grows toward that 3.5% threshold.
Right.
But if they crush the protests, they risk losing the loyalty of the very forces they need to do the crushing. It's like pouring gasoline on a fire of legitimacy.
That is a perfect analogy. And the key difference is that this negative feedback loop for the state is largely neutralized if the challenging group is armed.
Because then it's a fair fight, so to speak.
Because if the opposition uses violence, the regime can immediately frame its repression as a necessary security measure against terrorists or insurgents. And that justifies crackdowns to both domestic and international audiences. Nonviolent discipline forces the state to expose its naked brutality.
That mechanism takes us perfectly into our next section, Section 4, Systems Mapping, how power shifts. Because if the core mechanism of success is mass participation overwhelming the state, then the state's power must rely on the cooperation of its people, not just its guns.
Absolutely. Chenoweth and Stephan, drawing on these classic theories of nonviolent conflict, they use this foundational insight that state power is conditional. It rests entirely on what they call the pillars of support.
Pillars of support.
The state's coercive capacity isn't unlimited. It relies heavily on the continued loyalty of key institutions to function, to collect taxes, to maintain order.
Okay, so let's map out the state's internal organs. The 4 key things a regime absolutely needs to function.
The 4 most critical pillars are, first, the security forces. That's the police, the army, the internal intelligence services, the people who enforce compliance.
The stick.
The stick, yes. Second, the economic elites. The major business leaders, bankers, financial interests whose operations fund the state and maintain stability.
The money.
The money. Third, the bureaucracy and civil servants. This is the huge network of administrators, tax collectors, judges, utility workers who actually run the day-to-day functions of governance.
The machine itself.
And fourth, the state-controlled media and ideological supporters. These are the people who provide the narrative, the justification, the legitimacy for the regime's rule.
The story.
The story.
A regime can weather public dissatisfaction for a long time, but if one of those pillars starts to crack, the whole structure becomes unstable very quickly.
Very quickly.
So how does nonviolence strategically target those cracks? Let's start with the security forces, the pillar most critical for repression.
This is leverage point 1, and it is the key indicator of success. The data shows that nonviolent campaigns are 3 times more likely to produce defections among security forces compared to violent ones.
3 times more likely.
A 50% chance versus just a 20% chance. And when that loyalty shifts, the regime loses its ability to enforce compliance. Its repressive capacity it evaporates overnight.
But again, the question of incentives is paramount here. Why is it easier for a soldier to defect when they're facing unarmed people?
It fundamentally changes the calculus of risk and morality for them. If a soldier is facing an armed opponent, the situation is defined by military threat. They have a professional duty and a powerful self-preservation instinct to fire back. They're facing an existential enemy.
But if they're facing unarmed citizens,
If they're facing millions of unarmed citizens, people who might be their relatives, their high school teachers, their own children, the situation is defined by moral dilemma. Nonviolent methods don't pose a direct military threat to their physical safety. So defection, or just disobeying orders, becomes a morally justifiable and, crucially, a physically less risky choice than engaging in brutality against their own people.
and the data linking the scale of the protests to defections is staggering here.
It is. When participation in a nonviolent campaign becomes truly massive, getting close to, say, 70% of the movement's maximum potential participation, though still well short of 3.5% of the whole population, the probability of security force defection spikes to around 70%.
So the sheer numbers create a moral and physical shield for would-be defectors.
Exactly.
The classic definitive example of this has to be the Philippines People Power Revolution in 1986.
That case is a masterclass in exploiting this leverage point. In February 1986, after a rigged election, you had these widespread nonviolent protests. Key regime figures, Defense Minister Enrile and Armed Forces Chief Ramos, defected from the Marcos regime.
Right.
They set up their command in military camps, but they were immediately vulnerable to loyalist forces.
So what happened next was the key systemic shift.
It was everything. Millions of unarmed Filipinos, mobilized by the Catholic Church and the organized opposition, they poured into the streets and surrounded those military camps. They formed human shields.
So Marcos couldn't just shell them.
He couldn't order his loyalist troops to fire heavy artillery into masses of unarmed citizens. The nonviolent crowds provided the crucial physical and moral security for the defecting military leaders, and that paralyzed Marcos's remaining coercive power. It led to his swift downfall without a military coup or a civil war.
So the nonviolent crowd became more than just a symbol of opposition. It became an active, physical defensive mechanism for the regime's own defectors.
Precisely. The armed forces stopped being a loyal pillar for Marcos and instantaneously became a source of irreversible vulnerability.
Okay, now let's turn to leverage point 2, non-cooperation and the bureaucracy economy. How do nonviolent tactics target those financial and administrative pillars?
This goes after the second and third pillars, the economic elites and the civil service. Violent resistance often destroys economic infrastructure, which harms the opposition's base just as much as the regime's.
Right.
But nonviolent tactics like general strikes, boycotts, and organized civil service non-cooperation, they directly attack the state's ability to function and its economic resources without any physical destruction.
They starve the state.
They starve it. When civil servants stop administering taxes, when banks halt transactions, when key industrial workers like oil workers stop producing revenue, the state cannot function. It can't pay its security forces. It can't fund its bureaucracy. It can't organize repression. The state is starved of its operational lifeblood.
The Iranian Revolution of 1978-79 is often mythologized as an armed revolution. But Chenoweth and Stephan argue the tipping point was fundamentally nonviolent.
That's a crucial correction this research provides. I mean, yes, there were violent factions and ideological conflicts, but the ultimate success against the Shah's incredibly powerful U.S.-backed military machine that relied on a systematic, decentralized campaign of non-cooperation.
And specifically crippling his revenue streams.
Specifically, the famous oil worker strikes were the strategic masterpiece. Iran's economy was almost entirely dependent on oil exports. So when those highly specialized workers walked off the job, refusing to pump or export, the Shah's revenue plummeted from $150 million a day to practically zero.
$150 million a day to zero.
And that massive economic blow, combined with general strikes and civil service non-cooperation, it rendered the state bankrupt. It became incapable of paying or sustaining its military and its secret police, SAVAK. The nonviolent strikes delivered the knockout blow that decades of armed opposition had failed to achieve.
That raises the question of scaling and resilience, especially against a powerful surveillance state like the Shah's. How could the resistance be everywhere at once without a central command for the state to target?
The key is decentralization and network resilience. A violent campaign needs a visible, hierarchical command structure for tactical deployment, for arms distribution. This makes it extremely vulnerable to what are called decapitation strikes. You capture or kill the few key leaders, and the whole movement collapses.
But nonviolent movements are different.
By contrast, they utilize decentralized pre-existing networks. In Iran, it was the Bazar-e-Ulema network, this coalition of traditional merchants and religious leaders using the ubiquitous mosque network. That provided an effective capillary communication channel.
So messages could spread organically.
It allowed for the rapid dissemination of instructions and the organization of opposition, completely circumventing the state's centralized surveillance. It allowed for massive mobilization without a central hierarchy.
So a decentralized structure means there is no single head to cut off. The movement can absorb repression without collapsing.
Precisely. It allows for quick, massive mobilization.
Yeah.
And because the targets are ubiquitous, the entire civil service, every oil refinery, every street corner, the scale of the non-cooperation just paralyzes the regime. The sheer physical inability to arrest, process, or repress millions of non-cooperators neutralizes the state's coercive power through overwhelming number.
Which loops us right back to that powerful repression feedback loop.
Exactly.
So let's just summarize that loop one more time. When the challenge is armed, the regime uses force, and the world says.
That's understandable. They're fighting terrorists. The state finds justification.
But when the target is unarmed, violence against the population is framed systemically as an injustice.
Right. And this creates the powerful backfire effect. It forces loyalty shifts among key domestic elites and international observers. It is a structural feedback loop where the state's greatest source of power, its monopoly on force, becomes its greatest systemic vulnerability when confronted by disciplined nonviolence.
This analysis, which is based on data up to 2006, feels like a direct map for understanding so many modern movements. Let's shift our focus to Section 5, present-day implications. How do these strategic findings translate to the world we live in now, especially with the acceleration of digital communication?
The core strategic logic is remarkably durable. I mean, the physics of power are still the same. Mass participation and nonviolent discipline are still the key leverage points that force shifts in loyalty among the regime's pillars.
It's still about the pillars.
It's still about the pillars. We saw this logic play out in the early 2000s in those movements challenging electoral fraud, the color revolutions in Serbia, Georgia, and Ukraine. These were not military coups. They were mass mobilization, nonviolent campaigns that exposed fraud, mobilized a critical mass, and compelled institutional change.
And the findings apply robustly across different kinds of regimes, right?
Absolutely. The research shows that nonviolence is highly effective against these entrenched, closed, authoritarian regimes because it fundamentally attacks their source of legitimacy and their capacity to govern. We saw that in Iran and the Philippines.
But what about regimes that are sort of in between?
It's also devastatingly effective in what are called competitive authoritarian regimes, states that hold elections but rig the rules. In those mixed regimes, nonviolent mass mobilization is essential because it exposes the fraud in such an undeniable way and compels institutional compliance. The integrity of the political system is just. It's neutralized when 3.5% of the population openly rejects it.
Okay, so now let's talk about digital mobilization. The prevalence of tools like social media with its rapid communication, does that just make nonviolence inherently easier now?
Digital tools certainly accelerate the nonviolent advantage, no question. They lower the mobilization barriers even further by allowing for rapid communication, organizing mass protests almost instantaneously, and crucially, documenting state repression in real time.
Which speeds up the backfire effect.
It speeds up the process of reaching critical mass and triggering the backfire effect internationally, yes. However, and this is a critical strategic tension, the essential component is still maintaining nonviolent discipline.
What do you mean?
If digital tools are used merely to organize small-scale tactical violence or to encourage an armed response, they provide the state with the exact justification it needs for a massive, justifiable crackdown. It neutralizes the backfire effect instantly. The state needs to see unarmed people to look monstrous when it hits them.
That tension between strategic effectiveness and tactical temptation is perfectly illustrated in the complex case of the First Palestinian Intifada from 1987 to 1993.
The First Intifada is such a powerful and difficult case study. It began as a spontaneous, popular, grassroots, nonviolent uprising. It was defined by widespread strikes, civil disobedience, resistance to curfews, organized boycotts of Israeli products, clandestine education networks.
So classic nonviolent tactics.
Classic tactics. And this mass nonviolent action achieved significant political concessions from Israel and drew massive international attention and sympathy. It was far more effective than the decades of failed violent insurgency attempts by the exiled Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO.
So that initial nonviolent phase generated unprecedented leverage. What fractured that strategy?
The strategic fracture really happened because of these persistent divisions within the Palestinian leadership, between the different PLO factions, between the exiled leadership and the leaders inside the territories, between secular nationalists and emerging Islamists.
So it became fragmented.
These divisions led to strategic inconsistencies, and crucially, a gradual growing shift toward armed tactics, often pushed by elements of the PLO leadership who struggled to coordinate the decentralized nonviolent movement.
And as soon as guns enter the picture,
As the movement increasingly adopted armed confrontations, the leverage began to erode. Israel was then able to revert to its familiar, justifiable military security responses. It allowed them to deal with the movement as a security threat, rather than a political crisis rooted in occupation. The strategic advantage, that moral high ground and the backfire effect, was lost, which led to a diminished outcome compared to the potential of that initial nonviolent phase.
so that case really demonstrates the fragility of the strategic advantage. Once nonviolent discipline is lost, the movement sacrifices its unique systemic leverage point.
It forces the opponent back onto their preferred terrain, which is the battlefield of superior coercion. The key lesson here is the prioritization of scale and discipline over the temptation of coercion. The data is just unequivocal. Movements must prioritize mobilization over attempting to match the state's coercive force. Violent resistance campaigns, regardless of type, are statistically the less effective strategic choice overall.
That shifts our focus perfectly into Section 6, connecting these findings to the broader analytical themes we explore here on crisis and perception. This book fundamentally alters our perception of power itself.
It absolutely does. The research provides the empirical evidence for the core systemic insight that power is conditional on consent. Chenoweth and Stephan prove, with hard numbers, what political theorists have long argued. A state's effective authority relies on the acquiescence and loyalty of its civilian population and its functionaries.
So the greatest leverage for change.
The greatest leverage comes not from military strength, but from the strategic, organized withdrawal of that consent, through general strikes, economic boycotts, and most critically, security force defections. Nonviolent resistance is a strategic system that targets the operational core of the state's operating system. It dismantles it from the bottom up by cutting off its economic and administrative supplies.
Which reframes nonviolence away from a moral philosophy and into what you called a highly effective political technology. It's a mechanism.
It is structural leverage, not moral framing. The choice of nonviolence is effective because it's a mechanical system for maximizing the recruitment base, which minimizes the physical risk for participants, while simultaneously maximizing the political cost and failure rate of the adversary's coercive response. It's a purely structural advantage, built on exploiting the regime's reliance on the loyalty of its own people.
This also ties back to the idea of systems over individual heroism. When we study history, we often focus on these iconic figures, but the data here suggests leaders are less important than the collective capacity.
Exactly. Success, according to this data, is rarely dependent on the tactical brilliance or personal sacrifice of a single leader. Campaign success hinges on the coordinated actions of millions of diverse participants across every single sector: labor, students, religious groups, the bureaucracy, business.
So the focus shifts.
It shifts entirely from the tactical genius of a few militants to the systemic mobilization capacity and organizational resilience of decentralized networks. The movement is the system. The leader is merely the highly visible conductor, but the orchestra is what produces the necessary sound.
And the final theme here is the systemic opposition between violence and legitimacy.
Violent resistance almost always plays into the hands of the state. It legitimizes the state's repressive apparatus. It frames the conflict as a necessary security threat, which justifies martial law, massive military spending actions that are easy for states to fund and execute.
Whereas nonviolent resistance.
Nonviolent resistance, conversely, strips the state of its legitimacy. It exposes the state's brutality and its inherent structural weakness to its own citizens and to international partners. It creates internal and external pressure for defection and support withdrawal. It forces the state into an impossible strategic position: either tolerate the rising opposition or repress them brutally and trigger the inevitable backfire effect.
This research is so potent because it relies entirely on this overwhelming empirical data to make a strategic argument that just It flies in the face of centuries of historical bias. Which brings us to our conclusion, Section 7. Reflection. What fundamental shift in perception does this data demand from us?
It forces us to acknowledge that our intuitive response to conflict, that the only way to beat a tank is with a better weapon, is statistically and strategically wrong. The empirical evidence is overwhelming. Nonviolent resistance is the superior strategic choice for achieving transformative political goals and for establishing durable democracies. It's a political weapon of mass participation, not merely a moral conviction.
Why do you think our intuition about violence so often fails us?
I think our intuition focuses on the visible physical threat posed by the state, the machinery of coercion. We naturally gravitate toward the idea of military parity or superiority as the necessary countermeasure. But the data shows this approach is largely a losing strategy. It succeeds only 26% of the time, and it creates unstable, undemocratic outcomes even when it does succeed.
So we're focused on the wrong target.
The effective strategy, the one with the 53% success rate, requires focusing on political and institutional leverage, mass mobilization, and non-cooperation. These tactics dismantle the state's institutional capacity by withdrawing consent. Power does not flow from the barrel of a gun. It flows from the loyalty and consent of the populace and the functionaries who operate the system.
But no study can resolve every strategic challenge. What strategic questions do Chenoweth and Stephan's findings leave unresolved for, future analysis of modern movements?
There are two major strategic challenges that still preoccupy researchers. First, there's the challenge of hybrid movements. How can nonviolent campaigns strategically manage the inevitable occurrence of violence, whether it's spontaneous or externally introduced within or adjacent to their actions without losing their core advantage?
Right. We saw that in the Intifada example. That strategic discipline can be lost so easily.
And it neutralizes the leverage. Maintaining that discipline under extreme duress is fragile. And second, we need a deeper understanding of the precise conditions under which severe repression fails to generate the backfire effect.
When it doesn't work.
When it doesn't work. For instance, the 1988 movement in Burma struggled greatly because the regime was utterly brutal and politically insulated, which made it difficult to sustain mass mobilization despite the severe repression. We know nonviolent campaigns fare statistically better even under high repression, but does regime type or geopolitical insulation or just extreme sustained brutality sometimes overcome the nonviolent advantage? Understanding those pressure points is essential for movements planning strategy today.
That brings us to our final thought. If the strategic success rate for nonviolent resistance is 53% versus 26% for violent resistance, movements must face a fundamental strategic choice. Are we choosing the strategy that makes us feel powerful by fighting back, or the strategy that the cold, hard data proves is powerful? The strategic logic of nonviolence forces the opponent to fight on the challenger's terrain, the battlefield of legitimacy, consent, and mobilization, a terrain the modern coercive state is fundamentally ill-equipped to win. This deep dive was based on the landmark research contained in Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict by Erica Chenoweth and Maria J. Stephan. We strongly encourage you to read the book yourself, engage with the underlying research, or check your local library for access. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.